I found a living medieval world inside a glass display box I bought at an estate sale for $12. A single grain of rice from my kitchen could feed an entire village for a week. From that day on, I became their god. It wasn't until I saved a thumb-sized girl from a bandit's blade and understood their language that I realized this wasn't some elaborate diorama or a child's toy. This was a real medieval continent, currently in the middle of a brutal civil war and a famine that had already killed millions. The girl I had saved was named Elara. She was carrying a cracked clay pot, desperately scraping the last bits of flour from the bottom of it. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her face gaunt, her ribs visible through the thin linen of her dress. If she found a single edible root, she would clutch it to her chest like it was a bar of solid gold. I was about to turn around and grab some breadcrumbs from my kitchen. But before I could move, a group of mounted soldiers came thundering into the village. They wore tarnished chainmail and carried spears with rusted tips. Their leader, a scarred man with a cruel mouth and yellow teeth, pointed his spear at the village elder and demanded grain. The elder, a thin old man with a white beard, fell to his knees. "My lord, we have nothing. The crops failed. 3 seasons running. We've eaten the seed stock. We've eaten the rats. We've eaten the leather from our boots." The soldier didn't even blink. He swung his spear and struck the old man across the face. The elder collapsed, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead. Elara screamed and threw herself over the old man's body. The soldier raised his spear again, this time aiming at Elara. He grinned. It was the kind of grin that belonged to a man who had done this before and would do it again without a second thought. Something cold and sharp ignited in my chest. I lifted the glass cover of the box, extended my right index finger, and flicked it directly at the soldier's chest. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The soldier flew backward as if hit by a cannonball, his armor crumpling inward. He smashed into the stone wall of the nearest building and slid down, motionless. His neck was bent at an angle that necks are not supposed to bend. The remaining soldiers froze. Their horses reared in panic. They looked around wildly, but of course they couldn't see me. To them, their commander had simply been launched across the village by an invisible force. "What witchcraft is this?" one of them shouted, his voice cracking. I flicked again. Another soldier went flying. This one hit a tree trunk and dropped like a stone. Then a third. The rest broke and ran, spurring their horses into a frantic gallop. They didn't stop until they disappeared over the horizon. Elara slowly raised her head. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, looked past the village, past the sky, and locked directly onto my face. In that gaze, I saw terror, desperation, and something else. Recognition. She knew, somehow, that there was something watching from above. She fell to her knees and pressed her forehead to the dirt. "Almighty One," she whispered, "save us." My heart hammered against my ribs. These weren't toys. These were living, breathing people, and I was the only thing standing between them and extinction. I washed my hands, sat back in my chair, and stared at the box for a long time. My fingers were shaking. I told myself it was from the adrenaline. Then I went to sleep. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that soldier's neck bent at the wrong angle. I told myself he deserved it. I still believed it, but it wasn't a comfortable thought. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was rush to the box. Elara was already outside the village, digging in the cracked earth with her bare hands. She was looking for anything edible. She was starving. I went to my kitchen, opened the rice cooker, and scooped out a single grain of cooked white rice. It was still warm. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, lowered my hand into the box, and set it gently on the ground in front of her. From her perspective, this wasn't a grain of rice. It was a white boulder the size of a carriage, steaming, radiating heat, smelling of something she hadn't experienced in months. Food. Real food. She stared at it for a full 10 seconds. Then she fell to her knees again, drew a symbol on her chest that looked like a cross with an extra horizontal bar, and whispered something I couldn't hear. She broke off a piece of the rice with both hands and shoved it into her mouth. Her eyes closed. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make the sensation last forever. When she swallowed, she started crying. Not the polite crying of someone who's moved. The ugly, gasping crying of someone who hasn't eaten in days and just realized they might actually survive. Then she stood up, broke off another piece, and ran back to the village. Within minutes, the entire village had gathered around the rice boulder. There were maybe 30 of them, all emaciated, all wearing the same ragged linen clothes. They stared at the rice like it was a religious artifact. Some of them were too weak to stand. They sat on the ground, leaning against each other, their eyes locked on the white mountain. The village elder, the same one the soldier had struck, stepped forward with trembling hands. He broke off a piece the size of a walnut, put it in his mouth, and immediately dropped to his knees. "This is a miracle," he said, his voice shaking. "The gods have not abandoned us. They divided the rice carefully, each person getting a piece no bigger than a thumbnail. When they were done, more than half of it remained. I reached in, scooped up the leftover rice, and tossed it into my trash can. The villagers watched the giant hand vanish into the clouds and fell silent. A few of them crossed themselves. I needed to think. This box connected to a real world, a medieval world in the middle of a famine and a civil war. 30 people in one village wouldn't survive on my kitchen scraps. I needed a system. I needed to understand the rules. I went to the supermarket and bought a bag of flour, a sack of salt, a package of dried beans, and a bottle of cooking oil. Back home, I set everything on the desk next to the box and started planning. Step 1. Water. The village was surrounded by cracked, dry earth. There was no well, no river, nothing. I grabbed a plastic cup, filled it with tap water, and carefully poured a few drops into the box, aiming for a depression in the ground outside the village. From their perspective, a column of water the size of a waterfall crashed into the earth, carving out a small pool in seconds. The villagers ran out of their houses, staring at the miracle with their mouths open. A child, no older than 5, ran to the edge of the pool and cupped water in his hands. He drank like an animal, water spilling down his chin, and then he started laughing. It was the first time I'd heard a child laugh in this world. It didn't make me feel good. It made me feel responsible. "I'll fill it every day," I said, knowing they couldn't hear me but hoping Ilara would relay the message. Step 2. Food. I opened the bag of flour, grabbed a pinch, and dropped it into the village square. A mound of white powder the size of a small house appeared. The villagers approached it cautiously, as if it might be poison. The elder dipped his finger in, tasted it, and started weeping again. "Pure wheat flour," he said. "The finest I've ever seen. This is the work of the Creator." I watched them for a while, then turned to my computer and started researching medieval famines. I needed to know what I was dealing with. What year was it? What kingdom? What was happening in the wider world? I couldn't ask them directly. They didn't have a concept of calendars or geography beyond their immediate surroundings. I needed someone who could read, someone who understood the broader world. I told Ilara, through gestures and pointing, that I needed her to find someone educated. A scholar, a priest, anyone who could read and write. She nodded and ran off. While I waited, I did what any rational person would do. I went online and ordered a custom-made medieval fortress model. 1:200 scale sheet metal construction with working gates and arrow slits. It cost me $2,000. I didn't care. If I was going to play God, I was going to do it right. 3 days later, Elara returned with a man named Corwin. He was a former monastery scribe, expelled for heresy after questioning the church's interpretation of a sacred text. He was thin, sharp-featured, and had the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He walked with a limp, the result of a beating he'd received from church guards during his expulsion. He took one look at the flower mountain, the water pool, and the sky above, and immediately fell to his knees. But unlike the others, he didn't pray. He studied. His eyes darted from the flower to the water to the sky, calculating, analyzing, trying to make sense of the impossible. "I am Corwin of the Order of the Silver Quill," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I was cast out for speaking truths the church did not wish to hear. If you are the creator, then I have questions. If you are a demon, then I am already dead, so it makes no difference." I liked him immediately. He wasn't afraid. He was curious. That made him useful. I used gestures to ask him about the world. He understood quickly and began speaking, with Elara translating through a combination of pointing and miming. The kingdom was called Vealoria. The current year, by the church's reckoning, was 847 of the Third Age. The king was dead, killed in battle by his own brother, Lord Malcor, who had seized the throne and was now marching his army across the countryside, burning villages that refused to swear fealty. The famine had lasted 3 years. A blight had destroyed the wheat crops, and the king's armies had burned the remaining stores during their campaigns. Millions had starved. Millions more were fleeing north, toward the mountains, where the soil was marginally less dead. Corwin paused, then looked up at the sky. "There is something else," he said. "The church has declared that the famine is divine punishment for heresy. They are burning anyone they accuse of witchcraft. In the capital, they've executed over 400 people in the past 6 months. The Inquisition has been given unlimited authority. They don't need evidence. They don't need witnesses. They just need a name." I sat back in my chair and processed this. A dead king, a usurper marching across the countryside, a famine killing millions, and a church burning people for heresy. This wasn't just a medieval world. This was the worst possible version of a medieval world. I needed to act. But I couldn't just drop food into the box forever. That wasn't sustainable. I needed to give these people the tools to survive on their own. I started with the basics. I ordered a set of miniature farming tools from a model shop. Tiny plows, hoes, and sickles, all made of metal. I dropped them into the village one by one, and the villagers treated each one like a holy relic. A blacksmith named Torin picked up one of the sickles, examined the edge, and looked up at the sky with an expression of pure professional jealousy. He'd spent his entire life forging iron, and this tool was sharper and more perfectly balanced than anything he'd ever made. Then I did something that would change everything. I went to my desk drawer and pulled out a magnifying glass. I held it over the village, focusing sunlight onto a patch of dry earth. Within seconds, the earth began to smoke. I moved the glass slightly, and a thin line of fire spread across the ground. The villagers screamed and ran. Corwin stood his ground, staring up at the sky with an expression I couldn't read. He wasn't afraid. He was taking notes. I stopped and set the glass down. Then I picked up a small packet of seeds I'd bought from a garden store. Wheat seeds. I dropped a handful into the box, aiming for the scorched earth. From their perspective, a rain of brown boulders fell from the sky. each one the size of a fist. Corwin approached one cautiously, picked it up, and examined it. "Seeds," he said, his voice trembling. "These are wheat seeds. But they're enormous, perfectly formed." He looked up at the sky. "Creator, do you intend for us to plant these?" I nodded, then realized they couldn't see me. I reached down and made a planting motion with my fingers. Corwin understood immediately. He organized the villagers. They dug holes, planted the seeds, and used the water from the pool to irrigate them. I watched the whole process with fascination. These were real people, with real intelligence, adapting to an impossible situation with remarkable speed. But I knew the seeds wouldn't grow fast enough. The famine was killing people now, not next season. I needed to do something bigger. I went to the kitchen and brought back a whole loaf of bread. I broke off a piece about the size of my palm and dropped it into the village square. A golden brown mountain of bread crashed into the ground, rolling dust and sending villagers scrambling. The smell alone was enough to make them drop to their knees. Corwin approached it, broke off a piece, and took a bite. His eyes closed. "This is bread," he said quietly. "But it's unlike any bread I've ever tasted. Soft, sweet. It melts on the tongue." He looked up at the sky. "Creator, what kind of world do you come from?" I couldn't answer that, but I could show them. Over the next few days, I established a routine. Every morning, I'd drop food into the village: flour, rice, beans, salt, oil. I built a small shelter out of cardboard and tape, which to them was a massive structure of impossible materials. I gave them tools, seeds, and a water source that never ran dry. The village grew. Refugees from neighboring settlements started arriving, drawn by rumors of a place where food fell from the sky. Within a week, the population had tripled. Within 2 weeks, it had quintupled. I needed to establish order. A village of 150 starving refugees was a recipe for chaos. And chaos was the one thing I couldn't afford. I dropped a printed sheet of paper into the village square. On it, I'd written a simple set of rules in English, knowing Corwin would try to decipher them. Next to the text, I'd drawn pictures. A person working, a person sharing food, a person being punished for stealing. Corwin studied the paper for hours. By evening, he had translated the basic concepts and was reading them aloud to the assembled villagers. Work is mandatory. Food is distributed equally. Theft is punished by exile. Disputes are resolved by the council. The Creator's word is final. The villagers accepted the rules without question. They had no choice. In a world where death was a daily reality, order was the only thing keeping them alive. But order wasn't enough. I needed defense. Lord Malcor's army was moving closer, and it was only a matter of time before they reached this village. I went to a hobby shop and bought a set of miniature medieval weapons. Tiny crossbows, spears, and shields, all made of metal and plastic. I dropped them into the village and watched as Corwin organized a militia. The refugees who had arrived with combat experience took the lead. They trained the others, drilling them in formation and basic tactics. Within a week, the village had a fighting force of 30 men and women, armed with weapons that were, by medieval standards, impossibly well made. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Malcor's army numbered in the thousands. 30 villagers with toy crossbows wouldn't stop them. I needed something bigger. I went online and found a company that made custom miniature models. I ordered a star fort, 1 to 200 scale, with multiple towers, thick walls, and a working gatehouse. It cost me $3,000. I didn't blink. While I waited for the delivery, I focused on the village's infrastructure. I dropped in a roll of duct tape, which the villagers used to patch their roofs. I dropped in a box of matches, which Corwin treated like a sacred artifact after discovering that striking one produced instant fire. I dropped in a small LED flashlight, which the villagers used as a beacon at night. To them it was a pillar of pure light that never dimmed, never flickered, never ran out of fuel. Corwin wrote an entire treatise on the nature of the eternal flame, but not everything went smoothly. On the 5th day, a group of 5 tax collectors arrived at the village. They wore the red and black livery of Lord Malcor's administration, and they carried long swords at their waists. Their leader was a fat man with a cruel smile and a leather whip coiled at his belt. They swaggered into the village like they owned it. The tax collector cracked his whip and demanded grain. The village elder tried to explain that they had nothing, but the tax collector wasn't listening. He'd seen the flower mountain. He'd seen the water pool. He knew this village had something special. He ordered his men to search the houses. They kicked in doors, overturned furniture, and terrorized the villagers. One of them grabbed Alara by the arm and demanded to know where the food was stored. She tried to pull away, and he backhanded her across the face. I didn't hesitate. I extended my left index finger and thumb and clamped down on the tax collector's shoulder. From his perspective, 2 invisible mountains had just closed around his body. He screamed. His bones cracked. I lifted him into the air, dangling him a dozen meters above the ground, his legs pedaling frantically. The other 4 tax collectors dropped to their knees, their faces white with terror. The one in my hand soiled himself and started begging for mercy. I lowered my voice and spoke directly into the box. "Get lost!" My voice hit them like a physical force. The 4 tax collectors on the ground scrambled to their feet and ran. I dropped their leader onto the dirt. He groaned, rolled over, and crawled after them on all 4s. The villagers cheered. But Corwin didn't cheer. He approached me, his face serious. "Creator," he said, "those men will return, and they will bring soldiers. You need to prepare." I knew he was right. The tax collectors were just the beginning. Malcor wouldn't let a village this well-stocked go unchecked. The fortress arrived 2 weeks later. I carried the massive box to my desk, opened it, and stared at the custom-built star fort. It was beautiful. Thick composite walls, multiple towers, inner courtyards, and a gatehouse that could be opened and closed with a small lever. I cleared the center of the village, lifted the fortress out of the box, and lowered it into place. It crashed into the ground with a sound like thunder, sending up a cloud of dust that blanketed the entire village. When the dust settled, the villagers stared at the fortress in stunned silence. Then they started cheering. Corwin fell to his knees and pressed his forehead to the ground. "Creator," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "you have given us a home, a fortress, a place to stand against the darkness." I moved the gatehouse lever, and the massive doors swung open. The villagers rushed inside, exploring the rooms, the towers, the courtyards. They claimed spaces, set up beds, and started organizing their new home. But I knew the real test was coming. Malcor's army was only days away. I spent the next few days preparing. I dropped in more weapons, more tools, more supplies. I organized the village's defenses, positioning the militia at key points along the walls. I set up a system of signals using the LED flashlight so the villagers could alert me to threats. Then I waited. They came on a Tuesday. I know because I was eating takeout when the alarm went off. I'd set up my phone to record the box, and the motion detection had triggered. I looked at the screen and saw them. Hundreds of soldiers marching in formation, their banners flying in the wind. At their head was a man in black armor, riding a black horse. Lord Malcor. The village was ready. The militia stood on the walls, crossbows loaded, spears at the ready. The refugees huddled inside the fortress, praying. Corwin stood on the main tower, holding the LED flashlight like a sacred staff. Malcor's army surrounded the village. The black-armored man rode forward and shouted something I couldn't hear. Corwin relayed the message through gestures. Surrender or die. I smiled. I reached into the box, picked up a small plastic trebuchet I'd bought from a toy store, and lowered it onto the wall. The villagers stared at the strange device, then looked to Corwin for instructions. I made a loading motion, then pointed at the enemy army. Corwin understood. He ordered the militia to load the trebuchet with stones, aim it at the army, and fire. The first shot was a disaster. The stone fell short, landing harmlessly in the dirt. The army laughed. Malcor raised his hand, and his archers knocked their arrows. I reached in, adjusted the trebuchet's angle, and loaded another stone. This time, the stone flew true, smashing into the front ranks of the army. Soldiers went down, screaming. The laughter stopped. I adjusted the trebuchet again, loaded another stone, and fired. And again, and again. Each shot was more accurate than the last. The army began to break. Malcor, realizing this wasn't a normal village, ordered a retreat. His army turned and fled, leaving dozens of dead and wounded on the battlefield. The villagers cheered. Corwin raised the LED flashlight to the sky, and the villagers fell to their knees, praising the Creator. I sat back in my chair, exhausted but satisfied. We'd won. But I knew this was only the beginning. Malcor would be back, and next time he'd bring more soldiers, better weapons, and a lot more anger. I needed to prepare. I needed to grow. I needed to become something more than just a guy dropping food into a box. I looked at the village, at the people who depended on me, and I made a decision. I was going to build them an empire. But first, I needed to understand the limits of my power. I needed to test the boundaries of the box. I started with something simple. I placed a small toy car at the edge of the box and pushed it toward the glass wall. The car passed through the glass without any resistance and disappeared from my field of view. I waited. A minute passed. 2 minutes. The car didn't come back. I tried again, this time with a grain of rice. Same result. It passed through the glass and vanished. Then I tried something different. I placed a villager near the edge. One of the refugees, a young man named Kael, who had been a soldier before his village was burned. I gestured for him to walk toward the edge. He hesitated, then obeyed. He walked to the glass wall, reached out, and touched it. His hand passed through. He gasped, pulled back, then reached out again. This time, he stepped through. He was gone. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. He didn't come back. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Had I just killed him? Had he fallen into the void between worlds? Or had he simply walked away into the wider world of Vialoria? I didn't know, and not knowing was terrifying. I needed more information. I turned to Corwin. I asked him, through gestures, if there were other villages like this one, other places where the sky opened up and food fell from above. He shook his head. No, this was the only one, the only place where the Creator's hand reached down. That meant I was the only one, the only God this world had. The weight of that realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just helping a village. I was responsible for everything that happened in this world. Every death, every famine, every war. I could stop it all. Or I could let it burn. I chose to stop it. But stopping it meant making choices. Hard choices. Choices that a rational person wouldn't want to make. I needed allies. I needed people who could act on my behalf in the wider world. Corwin was smart, but he was a scholar, not a leader. I needed someone with military experience. Someone who could command an army. I told Corwin to find me a soldier, not a militia fighter, a real soldier, someone who had led men in battle. He returned 3 days later with a woman named Vessa. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a scar running from her left ear to her jaw. She had been a captain in the king's army before Malcor's coup. When the king died, she refused to swear fealty to the usurper and was branded a traitor. She'd been living in the mountains, leading a band of deserters, raiding supply lines, and ambushing patrols. She took one look at the fortress, the flower mountain, and the sky above, and didn't fall to her knees. She drew her sword. "I don't care if you're a god or a demon," she said, her voice cold and steady. "If you're going to help us fight Malcor, I'll follow you. If you're going to sit up there and watch us die, I'll find a way to kill you too." I liked her even more than Corwin. I dropped a printed map of the region into the village square. It was a rough sketch I'd drawn based on Corwin's descriptions, showing the major cities, roads, and military positions. Vessa studied it for hours, her finger tracing the routes Malcor's army had taken, identifying choke points, supply lines, and weak positions. She came back to me with a plan. Malcor's army was stretched thin. He'd conquered half the kingdom, but he didn't have enough soldiers to hold it all. His supply lines were vulnerable. His garrisons were understaffed. If we hit him in the right places, we could collapse his entire operation. But we needed an army. 30 militia fighters wouldn't be enough. We needed hundreds, thousands. I looked at the village. It had grown to over 200 people. Refugees kept arriving, drawn by the rumors of a place where the Creator provided. I couldn't keep feeding them all forever, but I could give them the means to feed themselves. I dropped a set of farming instructions into the village, simple illustrated guides on crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management. Corwin and Vessa organized work crews. They cleared land, planted crops, and built irrigation channels from the water pool. Within a month, the village had its first harvest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to supplement the food I was dropping in. The refugees started to feel something they hadn't felt in years: hope. But hope wasn't enough to stop an army. I needed weapons. Real weapons. I went to a model shop and ordered a set of miniature cannons. They were expensive, but they were the best I could find. I dropped them into the village and watched as Vessa's engineers figured out how to use them. The first test firing was spectacular. The cannon roared, and a tiny cannonball flew across the village, smashing into a target I'd set up. The villagers covered their ears and stared in awe. Vessa grinned. "This will do," she said. "But cannons weren't enough. I needed intelligence. I needed to know what Malcor was planning. I needed spies. I told Corwin to find me someone who could move unnoticed through the kingdom, someone who could gather information and bring it back. He returned with a young man named Finn. He was small, quick, and had the kind of face you forgot the moment you looked away. He had been a thief before the famine, surviving by stealing from the rich and giving to himself. When the famine hit, he'd turned to espionage, selling information to whoever paid the most. Corwin had bought his loyalty with a bag of flour. Finn didn't fall to his knees. He didn't pray. He looked up at the sky and smiled. "So, you're the one dropping food from the heavens?" he said. "Interesting. I've heard the rumors. Didn't believe them until now. What do you need?" I dropped a small notebook and a pencil into the village. Finn picked them up, examined them, and raised an eyebrow. "Fancy," he said. "What's this for?" I gestured for him to write down everything he saw. Every soldier, every supply line, every weakness. He nodded. Consider it done. Finn left the village that night. He was gone for 2 weeks. When he returned, he had a notebook full of information. Malcor was planning a major offensive. He was gathering his forces in the capital, preparing to march north and crush the last pockets of resistance. His army numbered in the tens of thousands. His supply lines were stretched, but he had enough food to sustain the campaign for at least 3 months. But there was a weakness. Malcor's army was made up of conscripts, farmers, laborers, and prisoners who had been forced to fight. They weren't loyal to Malcor. They were loyal to their own survival. If we could break their morale, the army would collapse. Vessa studied the notebook and nodded. We don't need to defeat Malcor's army, she said. We need to make them not want to fight. If we can show them that there's a better option, they'll desert. An army without soldiers is just a bunch of guys in fancy clothes. I liked the plan. It was efficient. It was ruthless. It was exactly the kind of strategy I needed. I spent the next few weeks preparing. I dropped in more food, more weapons, more supplies. I organized the village's defenses, trained the militia, and set up a network of signal fires that could alert me to threats from any direction. Then I waited. Malcor's army came on a cold morning in late autumn. I know because I was drinking coffee when the alarm went off. I'd set up my phone to record the box, and the motion detection had triggered. I looked at the screen and saw them. Thousands of soldiers marching in formation, their banners flying in the wind. At their head was a man in black armor, riding a black horse. Lord Malcor. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought siege engines, catapults, battering rams, and towers. He wasn't going to ask for surrender. He was going to take the village by force. The village was ready. The militia stood on the walls, crossbows loaded, cannons positioned. The refugees huddled inside the fortress, praying. Corwin stood on the main tower, holding the LED flashlight like a sacred staff. Vessa stood beside him, her sword drawn, her eyes cold. Malcor's army surrounded the village. The black-armored man rode forward and shouted something I couldn't hear. Corwin relayed the message through gestures. This is your last chance. Surrender or be destroyed. I smiled. I reached into the box, picked up a small plastic trebuchet, and lowered it onto the wall. Then I picked up a lighter. I didn't just want to defeat Malcor's army. I wanted to break it. I wanted to show every conscript, every farmer, every prisoner who had been forced to fight that there was a better option. I lit the lighter and held it over the battlefield. From their perspective, a pillar of fire descended from the sky, hovering above the army like the hand of an angry god. The soldiers froze. Some dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. Others turned and ran. Malcor shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the panic. His army was breaking. I lowered the lighter and ignited a small patch of dry grass at the edge of the battlefield. The fire spread quickly, creating a wall of flame that separated the army from the village. The soldiers on the far side of the fire turned and fled. The ones on the near side dropped their weapons and surrendered. Within minutes, the battle was over. Malcor's army had collapsed without a single shot being fired. Malcor himself sat on his horse, staring at the wall of fire, his face white with terror. He turned his horse and rode away, his remaining guards following close behind. The villagers cheered. Corwin raised the LED flashlight to the sky, and the villagers fell to their knees, praising the Creator. Vessa sheathed her sword and nodded. That was efficient, she said. I sat back in my chair, exhausted but satisfied. We'd won. But I knew this was only the beginning. Malcor was still out there. He would regroup, rebuild, and come back. I needed to finish this. I needed to end the war. I looked at the village, at the people who depended on me, and I made a decision. I was going to build them an empire, and I was going to start by taking the capital. But first, I needed to deal with the church, because the church was the real enemy. Malcor was just a symptom. The church was the disease, and diseases needed to be cured. I started with the church's local presence. Corwin told me about an Inquisition outpost in a town called Oakhaven, about 20 miles from the village. They'd burned 12 people there in the past month. 12. For crimes like reading the wrong book or questioning a priest's authority. I dropped a printed photograph into the village square. It was a satellite image of Oakhaven, showing the town layout, the Inquisition outpost, and the surrounding terrain. Corwin studied it with the intensity of a man reading a sacred text. "I need you to send Finn there," I told him through gestures. "I need to know how many soldiers they have, what weapons they carry, and when they plan their next execution." Corwin nodded and relayed the order. Finn left that night. While I waited, I focused on expanding the village's capabilities. I dropped in a set of miniature building materials, tiny bricks, wooden beams, and metal fasteners. The villagers used them to expand the fortress, adding workshops, storage rooms, and living quarters. The village was transforming from a refugee camp into a proper settlement. But the most important addition came when I dropped in a small book. It was a basic medical textbook I'd bought online, filled with diagrams of the human body, descriptions of common diseases, and instructions for basic first aid. Corwin took one look at it, and his hands started shaking. "This is knowledge that could save thousands of lives," he said. "The healers in this kingdom use leeches and prayer. This book contains more medical knowledge than the entire Royal Academy." I had him translate the most critical sections and distribute them to the village's healers. Within a week, they were using techniques that were centuries ahead of anything in Vealoria. Infections that would have been death sentences were being treated with basic hygiene and herbal remedies. But I knew that saving lives wasn't enough. I needed to change the balance of power. And that meant dealing with the Inquisition. Finn returned 5 days later, thinner than when he'd left, his clothes stained with mud and blood. He'd been caught by an Inquisition patrol and had to fight his way out. He'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand. He dropped his notebook on the ground in front of me and collapsed. I picked it up and read. The Inquisition outpost had 30 soldiers, armed with crossbows and swords. They had a small prison where they held accused heretics before their trials. The trials were a formality. The executions were not. Their next execution was scheduled for 3 days from now. A woman named Mara, accused of witchcraft because she'd survived a fever that killed everyone else in her family. The Inquisition called it proof of demonic protection. I called it basic immunity. I showed the notebook to Vessa. She read it, her expression darkening with each page. 30 soldiers, she said. "We can handle 30 soldiers, but we need to be smart about it. If we attack directly, they'll send reinforcements. We need to make it look like an accident." I liked the plan. It was cold. It was calculated. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I dropped in more weapons, more supplies, more tools. I organized a strike team of 20 fighters, led by Vessa herself. They would approach Oakhaven under cover of darkness, infiltrate the outpost, and eliminate the Inquisition soldiers before they could send for help. But I wasn't going to let them do it alone. I was going to give them an advantage that no medieval army could possibly counter. I went to my desk drawer and pulled out a small can of pepper spray. The night of the operation, I watched through my phone's camera as Vessa's team approached Oakhaven. They moved silently through the darkness, their faces painted with mud, their weapons ready. The Inquisition outpost was a small stone building with a wooden gate and a single guard tower. The guard on the tower was asleep. Vessa signaled her team forward. They reached the gate without being detected. Two of them climbed the wall, dropped down on the other side, and opened the gate from the inside. The team poured in. That's when the alarm sounded. Someone had spotted them. The guard on the tower woke up and started ringing a bell. Vessa didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her sword drawn, cutting down the first soldier who came at her. The rest of the team followed, engaging the Inquisition soldiers in close combat. But the soldiers were fighting for their lives, and they were fighting hard. Vessa's team was outnumbered and outmatched. Two of them went down in the first minute. I reached into the box with the pepper spray and aimed it at the largest group of soldiers. From their perspective, a cloud of invisible fire erupted from the sky, engulfing them in a burning mist that blinded them and stole their breath. They dropped their weapons, clawing at their eyes, screaming in agony. The rest of the soldiers saw their comrades fall to an invisible force and broke. They ran. Some made it out of the outpost. Most didn't. Within minutes, the battle was over. The Inquisition soldiers were dead or incapacitated. Vessa's team had lost 3 fighters, but they'd won. Vessa found the prison and freed the prisoners. Mara was there, along with 6 others, all emaciated, all terrified. They couldn't believe they were alive. Vessa led them out of the outpost and back toward the village. But before they left, she did something I hadn't expected. She took a torch and set fire to the Inquisition outpost. The stone building burned for hours, its wooden roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. When it was done, there was nothing left but ashes and rubble. A message, she told me later through Corwin. Let them know what happens to people who burn the innocent. I didn't argue. She was right. The prisoners arrived at the village the next morning. They were in bad shape, malnourished, dehydrated, traumatized. But they were alive. And they were grateful. Mara, the woman who'd been sentenced to burn, fell to her knees when she saw the fortress, the water pool, the flower mountain. She looked up at the sky and started crying. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just dropped a loaf of bread in front of her and let her eat. The destruction of the Inquisition outpost sent shockwaves through the region. Word spread quickly that a group of heretics had attacked the outpost and killed every soldier inside. The church was furious. They sent an investigation team to Oakhaven, but there was nothing left to investigate. Just ashes and bodies. But the investigation team made a critical mistake. They interviewed the survivors, the prisoners who'd been freed from the Inquisition prison. And those prisoners told them about a place where food fell from the sky, where the Creator's hand reached down, where the sick were healed and the hungry were fed. Word reached the capital, and the capital reached the church, and the church reached the Inquisition's high command. Within a week, the Inquisition had declared my village a heretical stronghold. They were gathering an army, a real army, not conscripts, not farmers, professional soldiers, trained, equipped, and fanatically loyal to the church. Corwin brought me the news with a face like stone. They're calling it the Holy Crusade, he said. 10,000 soldiers, led by Inquisitor General Voss himself. They're coming to purge the heresy. 10,000 against a village of 200. I sat back in my chair and thought about it. I could drop food, I could drop weapons, I could drop cannons and trebuchets and lighter fluid. But 10,000 professional soldiers was a different problem entirely. I needed to think bigger. I went to my computer and started researching. I needed to understand the Inquisition structure, their command hierarchy, their supply lines, their weaknesses. I needed to find a way to break them before they even reached the village. And then I found it. The Inquisition's army was funded by the church's tithes. Every village, every town, every city in the kingdom paid a portion of their income to the church. That money was used to fund the Inquisition's operations, including the Holy Crusade. If I could cut off their funding, I could stop the army before it even formed. I told Corwin to send Finn to the capital. I needed him to find out where the church stored its gold, how it was transported, and who was responsible for guarding it. Finn left that night. He was gone for 3 weeks. When he returned, he had a plan. The church's gold was stored in a vault beneath the Grand Cathedral in the capital. The vault was guarded by 20 elite soldiers, armed with the best weapons money could buy. But the vault had a weakness. It was connected to the city's sewer system. And the sewer system had an entrance outside the city walls. If we could get into the vault, we could steal the gold. Without the gold, the Inquisition couldn't fund the crusade. The army would disband. It was a crazy plan. It was dangerous. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I dropped in more weapons, more tools, more supplies. I organized a strike team of 10 fighters, led by Finn himself. They would infiltrate the capital through the sewer system, break into the vault, and steal the gold. But I wasn't going to let them do it alone. I was going to give them an advantage that no medieval thief could possibly counter. I went to my desk and pulled out a small flashlight. Then I pulled out a set of lockpicks I'd bought online. Then I pulled out a small can of WD-40. The night of the operation, I watched through my phone's camera as Finn's team approached the capital. They moved through the sewer system, wading through filth and darkness, following Finn's map to the vault entrance. They reached the vault door without being detected. It was a massive iron door, locked with a complex mechanism that would have taken a medieval locksmith hours to pick. Finn pulled out the lockpicks I'd given him and went to work. His hands moved with practiced precision, feeling the tumblers, aligning the pins, turning the cylinder. Within 5 minutes, the lock clicked open. The door swung open. Inside, the vault was filled with gold coins, stacked in neat piles, gleaming in the torchlight. Finn's team loaded the gold into bags and started carrying it out. But they couldn't carry it all. There was too much. I reached into the box with a small toy dump truck I'd bought from a hobby shop. I dropped it into the vault. From their perspective, a massive steel beast crashed through the ceiling, landing in the center of the vault with a thunderous boom. It had a large open bed and 4 massive wheels. Finn stared at it for a moment, then grinned. He loaded the gold into the truck's bed, climbed into the driver's seat, and figured out how to operate it. The truck was electric, powered by a small battery. It moved slowly but steadily, carrying the gold out of the vault and through the sewer system. The team followed, carrying the remaining bags on their backs. They made it out of the capital without being detected. By morning, the church discovered the theft. The vault was empty. The gold was gone. And there was no sign of how it had been taken. The Inquisition's crusade was cancelled. Without funding, the army disbanded. The soldiers went home. Inquisitor General Voss was recalled to the capital in disgrace. I sat back in my chair and smiled. We'd won again. But I knew this was only the beginning. The church wouldn't give up. They'd find another way to fund their operations. They'd send another army. They'd come back stronger. The church's response to the gold theft was swift and brutal. They declared a state of emergency across the entire kingdom, Every village, every town, every city was ordered to increase their tithes. Anyone suspected of involvement in the theft was to be arrested and executed. But the damage was done. The Inquisition's operations were severely disrupted. Without funding, they couldn't pay their soldiers, couldn't maintain their outposts, couldn't conduct their investigations. The organization was crumbling from within. I took advantage of the chaos. I sent Finn and his network of spies to every major city in the kingdom, spreading rumors about the village where the Creator provided. Refugees started flooding in from all directions, drawn by the promise of food, shelter, and safety. Within a month, the village had grown to over 500 people. Within 2 months, it had grown to 1,000. I needed to expand. The fortress was too small. The water pool was too small. The food I was dropping in wasn't enough. I went online and ordered a custom-built city model, 1 to 200 scale, with multiple buildings, streets, and a central plaza. It cost me $10,000. I didn't blink. While I waited for the delivery, I focused on organizing the growing population. I established a council of leaders, each responsible for a different aspect of the settlement. Corwin handled education and administration. Vessa handled defense and military training. Finn handled intelligence and espionage. A farmer named Harlow handled agriculture and food production. A healer named Elise handled medicine and public health. Together, they transformed the village into a thriving settlement. They built houses, farms, workshops, and markets. They established a system of governance, a set of laws, and a code of conduct. They created something that hadn't existed in Vialoria for centuries, a functioning society. But I knew that a functioning society wasn't enough. I needed a nation. And a nation needed an army. I told Vessa to start recruiting. She traveled to every village, every town, every city in the kingdom, spreading the word about the Creator's settlement. She offered food, shelter, and protection to anyone willing to fight. Thousands responded: farmers, laborers, prisoners, deserters, people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They came from all corners of the kingdom, drawn by the promise of a better life. Within 3 months, I had an army of 5,000 soldiers. They weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers and laborers who had been given weapons and training, but they were motivated. They were loyal. And they had something that no professional army could match. They believed in their cause. I spent the next few months preparing for war. I dropped in more weapons, more armor, more supplies. I organized the army into divisions, each led by an experienced commander. I established supply lines, communication networks, and intelligence operations. And then I waited. The church made the first move. They gathered their remaining forces and marched on the settlement. 10,000 soldiers, led by Inquisitor General Voss himself. They were determined to end the heresy once and for all. I watched them approach through my phone's camera. They were a massive force, well-equipped and well-trained. But they were fighting for a cause they didn't believe in. They were fighting because they were ordered to. And that made all the difference. I told Vessa to hold the line. I told her to let the church's army come to us. I told her to wait for my signal. She nodded and relayed the order. The church's army arrived at dawn. They formed up outside the settlement, their banners flying, their weapons gleaming in the morning light. Inquisitor General Voss rode forward and demanded our surrender. I smiled. I reached into the box and picked up a small megaphone I'd bought from an electronics store. I held it over the battlefield and spoke. "Soldiers of the church," I said, my voice amplified to a deafening volume. You are fighting for a cause that doesn't care about you. You are dying for leaders who will forget your names. Lay down your weapons and go home. No one will harm you." The soldiers stared up at the sky, their faces white with terror. Some dropped their weapons. Others turned and ran. The army was breaking. Voss shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the panic. His army was collapsing. I lowered the megaphone and picked up the lighter. I ignited a small patch of dry grass at the edge of the battlefield, creating a wall of flame that separated the army from the settlement. The soldiers on the far side of the fire turned and fled. The ones on the near side dropped their weapons and surrendered. Within minutes, the battle was over. The church's army had collapsed without a single shot being fired. Voss sat on his horse, staring at the wall of fire, his face white with terror. He turned his horse and rode away, his remaining guards following close behind. The soldiers who had surrendered were taken prisoner. I told Vessa to treat them humanely. Feed them, shelter them, and give them a choice. They could go home, or they could join our army. Most of them joined. I sat back in my chair, exhausted but satisfied. We'd won. But I knew this was only the beginning. The church would regroup, rebuild, and come back. I needed to finish this. I needed to end the war. I looked at the settlement, at the people who depended on me, and I made a decision. I was going to build them an empire. And I was going to start by taking the capital. But first, I needed to understand something fundamental about the box. I needed to know if what I did inside it had consequences outside it. If I changed this world, would it change the world I lived in? I started experimenting. I dropped a small LED light into the settlement and watched as the villagers used it to extend their working hours. They built more, farmed more, trained more. The settlement grew faster. Then I dropped a small solar-powered fan. The villagers used it to ventilate the buildings, to dry grain, to cool the sick. Quality of life improved. Productivity increased. But the most interesting experiment came when I dropped a small mirror into the central plaza. The villagers gathered around it, staring at their own reflections for the first time in their lives. Most of them had never seen themselves clearly. They wept, they laughed, they touched the glass with trembling fingers. Elara stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She looked at her face, no longer gaunt, no longer hollow. She looked healthy, she looked alive. Then she looked up at the sky. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Guilt. These people were suffering because of decisions I hadn't made, a war I hadn't started, a famine I hadn't caused. And yet I was the only one who could stop it. Every day I spent thinking about it was a day they spent starving. Every hour I hesitated was an hour more of death and destruction. I was done hesitating. I went to my computer and started planning. I mapped out the entire kingdom of Vialoria, identifying every major city, every military installation, every supply route. I calculated the resources I would need, the time it would take, the risks involved. It would take months, maybe years, but I had time, and I had power. I looked at the settlement one more time. The people were going about their daily routines. Working, farming, training, living. They had hope now. Something they hadn't had in years. I wasn't going to let them lose it. I was going to build them an empire. And I was going to start by taking the capital. But first, I needed to deal with the church. Because the church was the real enemy. Malcor was just a symptom. The church was the disease. And diseases needed to be cured.